All right, everybody. So now we're going to talk about the Runaway. So this is a pretty interesting character, and we're going to go through all of her abilities and all of her paths and just kind of talk about how she's used and what her abilities do and all that fun stuff. So just do keep in mind that this is early access, so things can change, things can update. Some of this stuff may change a lot, some of it might not change a lot, but as of this video, this is all up to date. So let's take a look at the Runaway. Now, if you don't know, the Runaway is the newest character added to Darkest Dungeon 2. She was not a character in Darkest Dungeon 1, so this is why she's probably the most interesting. One of the big things that she brings to the table is the new damage over time ability, which is Burn. And she has that in quite a lot of her abilities. She also has some really complicated, kind of interesting mechanics that are a little bit confusing if you don't understand how they work. So we're going to talk through all of those. All right, so the first of her abilities is pretty much her bread and butter, and this is Searing Strike. This can be done from the first or second position and can hit position 1 or 2 for the enemies. At base, it does 3 to 6 damage. When upgraded, it does 4 to 7 damage, so it's not a super high damage ability, but it also does apply burn. Now, it applies 2 burn when at the base. When mastered, it applies 3. The big thing here is that when the target has a combo token, it does double the burn, which can add up pretty quickly. So if you do have good combo generation, you can get her applying a decent amount of burn pretty quick. Now, her second ability is Firefly. This is one of her ranged abilities and is only usable from her in the back position. It can hit positions 2, 3, and 4, making it pretty versatile. Now, the difference between this and others of her abilities are that it does apply burn, but if the enemy is comboed, it actually has a chance to spread the burn to an adjacent enemy. Now, this is particularly interesting because if the enemy is in positions 2 or 3, you don't actually know which way it's going. It can spread it to a corpse and not an enemy, so it doesn't take precedence to spread it to an enemy if there's a corpse on one side of that person. So do keep that in mind. But if you do apply it to somebody in position 4, it is guaranteed to at least try to apply the burn to the person in position 3. So it is good to keep that in mind. As you can see here, at base, it applies 3 burn and then applies 3 burn to the adjacent target. And when mastered, it's 5 and then 3. Now, next is one of what I think is one of the most useful abilities that the Runaway has, and that's Smokescreen. So Smokescreen can use from any position, and it can be used from positions 1, 2, and 3 on the enemy side. It does have a cooldown of 1, meaning that you can't spam it, and on its base, it applies a combo token, which is pretty powerful, and it also applies blind. But what makes it pretty powerful is when it's upgraded, it applies 2 blind tokens and a vulnerable token and a combo token. This is really powerful, especially against like bigger enemies or bosses, because vulnerability allows you to do a lot more damage to them, as well as blinding them twice. If it's a boss, that's 2 attacks that they can't do, which is usually half of a boss's fight economy. So that's really powerful. Next, we have a pretty interesting ability, and that's her Run and Hide ability. Now, at base, this looks pretty mundane. It can be used from any position. It only applies to herself, and it has a cooldown of 1. What this ability does is it actually moves her back 1 and then applies stealth, which this can be pretty useful, especially if you have a Runaway that's more set up for the back rows, and she ends up getting shuffled and moved to the front, and you want to move her back. It's also pretty useful if she's in a position where you're worried that she's going to get hit to death's door or is already at death's door, and you want her to avoid taking any additional damage. You can apply stealth. Now, what makes this ability pretty interesting is when upgraded, it actually applies regeneration. Now, regen is a pretty interesting mechanic in this game. There's not many things that apply regen, and she's the only character currently that can have regen applied to her by one of her own abilities and not something like a trinket. So this is pretty powerful. It's really good if you're trying to keep her off death's door. It will apply a 3 heal for the next 3 turns, which means that if she's being hit down the death's door, she can heal herself back up. If she gets hit again, she can heal back up. And this is really good for her survivability and makes her pretty difficult to kill if she's got this going on for her. Next, we have her ability, Hearthlight. This is a pretty interesting ability. It can be used from any position, and it applies to all 4 enemies simultaneously. Now, that does mean that it has some pretty interesting applications, especially for like pulling off tokens from enemy, particularly dodge tokens. So you can use this ability to remove dodge tokens on for enemies. Say if you're going against spiders or you're going against cultists who have a lot of dodge, this can be pretty useful. The other thing that it does do is it ignores stealth and removes stealth tokens from enemies. So if you're up against some of the little pigs that end up giving themselves stealth pretty frequently, or the urchin who gives them stealth pretty frequently, this can be a pretty useful ability. Now, it does have a cooldown of 1, meaning that it can't be spammed. And at its base, it's a little bit mundane. Now, when it is upgraded, it does have the added benefit of ignoring blind. So if she's blinded, it'll hit anyway. And also removing blind off of not just her, but all of your allies. This is really powerful in, say, the Shroud, where the Leviathan's Breath can apply blind to all of your team simultaneously. Using this can be pretty powerful. All right, so next we have a pretty interesting ability of hers, which is called Ransack. Now, this does deal 3 to 6 damage. It's pretty mundane in the damage front. When upgraded, it deals 4 to 8, but it does have some pretty interesting mechanics. It can be used on targets in positions 1, 2, and 3. And what it does is when applied, it will actually move her forward 1 and pull a target forward 1. So this is pretty powerful, not just for moving her into a position if, say, she gets shuffled or you're trying to move your team around a little bit, but it can also remove an enemy, particularly useful on enemies in position 3 because they're kind of hard to hit, and pull them into position 1 or 2, which is usually an easier place to hit them. It also makes back row enemies a little less effective for the most part. Now, if that enemy is also combo tokened, it will apply burn to an adjacent monster. It won't apply burn to the monster that you're trying to hit, but it will apply it to a adjacent monster. So that's pretty interesting. You can end up pulling somebody and spreading burns. So this is part of her burn like spread mechanic. The next ability is one of her more surprising ones. This is one that I didn't really see coming into the game, and I'm pretty pleased to see it here, and that's Cauterized. So this actually allows her to heal if there is somebody on your team who has bleed applied to them. So it can only be used in positions 2, 3, and 4, so it can't be used from the front. And essentially what it does is if somebody has a bleed DOT applied to them, this will allow her to heal off that bleed. It will remove it and then heal 25% of that person's health. It does have 3 combat uses, but what makes this particularly different from other healing abilities in the game is that it doesn't have a threshold for that person to hit on their health for you to be able to use it. You can use this on somebody who's almost at full health and go ahead and apply the dot, remove the dot, and it will actually heal that person as well instead of just removing the dot like Battlefield Medicine does. So it is pretty powerful there. At its base, it heals 25%. When upgraded, it heals 33%. Doesn't change the amount of uses. It's still locked to 3. Okay, so now we're starting to get to some of the Runaway's more complicated and interesting mechanics. This one is called Controlled Burn. Now, what makes this one interesting is that it doesn't actually apply to the monster that you're hitting with it. It actually applies to the position that that monster is in. So it can be used from positions 1, 2, and 3 and can be applied to any of the 4 positions, which makes it particularly powerful. And it does also ignore stealth, which has quite a few uses. Now, what it ends up doing is it applies burn, it applies a special burn token. You can see that here, that little blue fire token, and that token is applied to the position, meaning that at the beginning of that monster's turn, if there is a monster on that position with control burn, it will apply a 3 burn attack to that person or that monster. So it makes it kind of interesting. You can basically have this applied to a position, and you can shuffle a team around and end up giving burn to lots of the different people on the enemy team. It's an interesting mechanic. When it's upgraded, it applies 4 burn, and it does have a cooldown of 3, which is one of the largest cooldowns in the game. So again, it's a pretty interesting one. Like I said, it's one of the only abilities that I know that we currently have that actually applies to a position and not to a monster, but it does have some particularly interesting uses. Now, next we have one of the more powerful, in my opinion, abilities that the Runaway has, and that's her other ranged ability called Dragonfly. Now, Dragonfly can be used from positions 1 and 2, and it applies to both positions 1 and 2 on the enemy side simultaneously. Now, what makes this a particularly useful ability is when it applies, it actually has a chance to deal a combo token, very similar to the Harvest ability on the Jester, and that can be applied to both positions 1 and 2. So if you're looking for somebody on your team who can generate a decent amount amount of combo tokens, this is a pretty good ability to have in your back pocket. Now, it does also apply a burn, and it does also move the Runaway back 1 position. So if you wanted to be able to use it twice in a row, you're going to have to put her in position 1 just to keep that in mind, because she'll move back to position 2. And then once she's in position 3, she can no longer use this ability. This does work pretty well with like Ransack when you're trying to move her back forward, so she can do Dragonfly again, etc. But yeah, so this works pretty well if you're trying to get a team that is using combo tokens. And when upgraded, it does actually apply a 4 burn instead of a 2, and has a 1 in 3 or a 33% chance to apply the combo tokens to the 2 enemies that it hits. All right, so again, getting to one of the pretty interesting mechanics and a pretty cool ability, in my opinion, we have the ability Firestarter. Now, Firestarter is actually applied to one of your own heroes, besides her, of course. And essentially what this does, it applies a buff to that hero, and actually gives them the ability to apply burn when they are hit, or when they hit, excuse me. So when they hit somebody, if they have this buff applied to them, that character, even though they don't have an ability that deals burn, will apply a 2 burn DOT. When upgraded, it actually upgrades to a 3 burn DOT. Now, this is particularly interesting. There's a lot of kind of niche uses for this, but one thing I like to do of it, just in my experience, is to put this on a character with riposte, so that way every time they get hit, they actually go ahead and return and then hit that character for damage and a DOT. It can be a pretty powerful ability. Okay, so now we get to probably the most complicated or confusing ability in the Runaway's arsenal, and that is her ability Backdraft. This ability can be used from positions 1 or 2 and can be applied to positions 2, 3, and 4. Now, essentially, what this does is that the monster that is in front of the monster that you are trying to attack must have burn. So if you're trying to apply this to the monster in position 2, the monster in position 1 must have burn applied to them. And what this does is it will deal the remaining 50% of the remaining damage of burn that is on monster 1 and apply it to the monster that you're attacking in the form of damage. So it's kind of complicated. I definitely understand that. But say you have on monster in position 1, you have 4 burn damage total remaining over the next couple. You have 2 rounds of 2 damage of burn on the position 1 monster. What this means is if you apply this attack to the monster in position 2, it will apply immediately a 2 damage burn to that monster. So there's some interesting uses of this. It does ignore guard, which makes it kind of curious as to what its uses are. But it moves up to 75% when upgraded. Still has a cooldown of 1. But if you can basically apply a large amount of burn, this will allow you to apply a pretty hefty single attack of damage to that monster using the burn. So pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and talk about the Runaway Paths. There are 3 of them currently available in the game. The first one is Survivor. So this is a more healing and survivability focused path. So the first of the effects is that her healing skills are given a plus 50% healing given to them, which means that her Cauterized and also her self-heal, her Rejuvenate, are affected by this. You can see that here with the healing over time given. So both of those effects get a additional plus 50% healing. This also gives her at combat start a set of 2 dodge tokens. That's the basic dodge, the 50% dodge tokens, and 1 speed token, meaning that the second round of combat, she will be most likely to go first unless somebody else also has a speed token. The next path of hers is Arsonist. So this gives her an additional burn chance, meaning that even enemies that are pretty strong against getting burn applied to them will be easier to burn with an additional 33% chance to cause that burn. It also gives her burn causing skills an additional 10% crit on all her skills that apply burn, which is pretty powerful because that does allow her, when you apply a crit with a damage over time ability, it gives you up to 5 rounds of damage over time, which can be pretty powerful. It does have a negative, and that negative, or a few negatives actually. The first negative being that it is minus 33% damage, so her raw damage output is lowered. This is kind of to make up for her additional damage over time ability. So you're not going to be dealing damage with the base ability, just the raw damage that it does. You're going to be trying to deal damage with the DOT. Now, it also does come with the turn start of applying 3 burn to herself. Now, this is a 1 in 4 chance of this happening, 25% chance of this happening. So you do have to be cautious of this. There is a chance that at the beginning of her turn, that's not just the round or the combat, but actually her turn, every turn, she has a 1 in 4 chance of applying 3 burn to her. So you definitely want to be cautious of that and keep that in mind. Her third and most recent ability definitely looks a little confusing. This path is called Orphan. So there's a lot going on here, but essentially it boils down to this. If she is in rank 1 or 2, she will lose the amount of burn that she deals, depending on it. So if she's in rank 1, she gets -2 burn dealt, which means that if she's dealing a 3 burn attack, she'll only deal 1. But in lieu of that, she gets additional damage in positions 1 or 2. So her raw damage output will go up pretty significantly, 40 and 20% retrospectively. Now, on the flip side, if you put her in positions 3 and 4, her burn duration is actually, or a burn amount is actually increased by 1 and 2 in positions 3 and 4 respectively, and then her damage is lowered, her raw damage is lowered by 20 and 40%. The other thing that she gets with this is if she uses her Firestarter skill on one of your heroes, she will apply a crit token to herself. So this is a pretty interesting one. It basically means that you can play her in different positions and kind of get different play styles out of her if you're looking for raw damage or for burn. So yeah, definitely some interesting things to play around with there. All right, so that pretty much covers all of the abilities currently available to the Runaway. Now, she's definitely an interesting character. A lot of people dislike her. A lot of people really like her. Of course, I'm actually pretty fond of her. I think she's a pretty powerful character, especially if played correctly. If you have the right trinkets of her, you can do all sorts of crazy amounts of damage. In fact, every time I've beaten the second chapter boss, I've done so because of damage from the Runaway. So she's pretty powerful. Definitely has some abilities that require a little bit more finesse and the thought and trying to line things up. But if used correctly, she can be a lot of fun.